very good evening to you. I am Lisa Lord, and my special guest is a gentleman with an exceptionally long list of titles. He has been a medical practitioner, a lecturer, historian, public orator, amongst many other titles. Professor Emeritus Sir Henry Fraser. Sir Henry, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to get back with you again.
Again, indeed, it's been some years.
Yes.
Now, throughout your working life, you have been exceptionally busy, and in your retirement, you're also keeping busy as well. As a historian, we understand the importance of going back to understand how we got where we are.
Right.
So how did your early life influence your decision into getting into the field of medicine?
Well, it's a very interesting story. My early life completely determined the direction I would take in life, which was always inspired by my father's exhortation, if you like Les Brown, to be the best you could be, to do the best that you could, and if you started something, to make sure that you finished the job. We had a fantastic childhood. We lived in the country in St. John, where the entire governance of the parish of St. John was operated from my father's little office in the corner of our home. He became the parochial treasurer of St. John in the old days of vestry governance. The vestry was the committee organized by the church with the parish priest as chairman and landowners elected. So they had landowners from the very wealthy, like the famous Mr. Simpson of Woodland, to the wonderful B.L. Barrow of Messiah Street, a wonderful, cheerful, chatty man whom we all loved. They were the committee that determined what the taxes would be on the land ownership of everyone in the parish. That money came in, and my father handled that money. Luckily, he was a very strong man with a great reputation as a boxer and a weightlifter. And because he was so strong, nobody ever burgled him. But the corner of our house was converted into an office, and everything was run from there. So the landowners paid the taxes, and he then paid all of the workers in the parish, from the parish doctor and the almshouse matron, all the way down the road inspector, the people who worked in the roads, the teachers at the primary school, were all paid basically out of my father's office. So every Friday he went to town with his little attache case and came home with money stored in a little safe in the corner. And every Saturday morning everybody came to the house and they stepped over my brother and me pitching marbles on the veranda in order to get the money to go back and pay their workers. My mother was the postmistress, and the post office was a little chattel house unit about 12 by 20 feet. And in that post office everyone came. My mother sat there, the postmen came to sort the mail and deliver it twice a day, and as a result, the entire population of the parish came to our little house. They knew all of us, and we knew many of them. So it was an environment where, as I always say, the entire parish was our extended family. And I have been able to drive through St. John as an adult, and people waved to me even before I was a TV person, because they remembered me and they remembered Mr. and Mrs. Fraser, who basically ran the parish. Now, when I grew up, I started painting from a very young age. And I wanted to be an artist for years. And my father said, you cannot be an artist because artists die poverty-stricken in garrets. And I was drawing things like houses, and I determined at the age of 13 I wanted to be an architect. And people said to me, Barbados already has an architect. We don't need another architect. That was the perception that people
At
had.
that time, yeah.
That if you were fairly clever, you either became a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. If you were not quite so clever, you might become a priest or a salesman or a planter. You know, those were the things that went through people's minds at school, when I was at the Lodge School. But eventually, I got inspired by the story of Christopher Codrington. Now, Christopher Codrington was an amazing visionary, and he left his estates in Barbados for the development of a college which, in his words, would train people in physics, chirurgery, and theology. And his vision was that if they could heal men's bodies, they would be better able to save their souls. And as an impressionable, emotional Christian boy of 15, I was hugely inspired by that story, which came to us from Sir Alexander Hoyas, my main mentor at school. And I got to know him very well, and I knew the Christopher Cotterington story backwards. And I was inspired, therefore, to become what I would be called in modern parlance a Christian doctor. My problem was as a teenager that I hated the sight of blood and I hated the sight of needles. And I thought, well, how am I going to be a doctor if I can't stand blood or needles? But I worked with faith and belief that somehow I would overcome these problems. A lot of young people are deterred from doing medicine because of that emotional teenage fear. But I said, I'm just going to work it out. I'm just going to get over it. So when I went into medicine, I thought, maybe what I'll do is become a research doctor. And so I trained myself in research, and I worked towards that. And so I'm what the Americans call a double doctor. I'm both a physician specialist and a clinical pharmacologist. And on the other side, I'm a research person. I did a PhD. And I did the PhD so that as there were so few PhD graduates in the Caribbean, I would be able to guide others in doing research. So my mission, therefore, became the mission of being a doctor and helping people, and the mission of doing fundamental research, which would have an even broader effect on healthcare.
And you would have spent an extensive period of your career at both the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and as a lecturer at the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus. Now, in fact, you're the retired Dean of Medical Sciences at Cape Hill and past University Dean of Medical Sciences.
Yes.
Specifically, have you seen a changing trend amongst young doctors entering the profession in terms of areas of subspecialty?
Well, yes. In the old days, you see, people didn't have a broad perception of all of the possibilities in medicine or of the nature of medicine. Specialization in medicine came only in the middle of the 20th century. Psychiatrists, for example, simply were doctors who took an interest in mental health problems, but there were no official training programs for psychiatrists until the middle of the 20th century. So most of us went into medicine thinking, I'm going to become a doctor. And our image and our role model was the GP or family doctor that we were acquainted with. I had the privilege of being exposed when I had paratyphoid fever and was very ill to Dr. Harry Bailey. So Dr. Harry Bailey became one of my 3 or 4 major heroes, if you like, in the field of medicine and as a medical career. So I always thought, well, I'll try to become a doctor like Dr. Harry Bailey. Many people go into medicine without knowing what kind of medicine they want to do, you see. So it's a very difficult challenge for us all, because when we graduate, we are then subjected to a kind of tortured year. It's a sadistic kind of approach, honestly. Because when I was an intern, my wife and I were interns at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in 1969-70, and we were working 100 hours a week. My wife's assignments made her, for part of that period, work even more than 100 hours a week. And I was lucky I worked a few less than her because of the assignment that I had. But we worked so hard, we had no time to think about what we really liked. And a lot of people go through internship, and some of them drop out. Particularly in Britain, that's still happening. Many of my acquaintances moved off to the USA. And the reason for that simply was that the university had been set up by a huge grant from the British, assigned during the Second World War, because the 1937 riots brought to the British administrators' notice the poverty of the people in the Caribbean, the total underdevelopment. And what is not generally known is that many millions of pounds were granted during the Second World War when the British were trying to save the world and themselves. And that money was under an administrative title of Colonial Development and Welfare. And that led to the formation of the University of the West Indies. And the vision was simply to create doctors, more doctors. This was the image. We needed more doctors. But they also developed public health. And there were some brilliant public health doctors that came out of that program, like Sir Maurice Beyer, for example, of the Maurice Beyer Polyclinic. And so the whole system was initially for public health, cleaning things up, mosquito control and so on, and family doctors, just to have enough doctors. So it took a long time for the university to recognize the need for specialty training. And when I graduated, Half of my medical class in Mona, Jamaica, went off to the USA in order to specialize. They wanted to specialize. So when I went back to Jamaica, I came to Barbados to intern to give something back to Barbados after my scholarship. And that's where I met my wife, and that's another long story. You'll find that in my autobiography, which is now on the shelves. But my wife and I went up to Jamaica, and we realized that we had lost some of the brightest members of our graduates. And so I started with Professor Mickey Waldron, who was a young lecturer at the time, and the famous Professor Figueroa, the AIDS guru of the Caribbean. And the three of us led a group called the Action Group to get postgraduate training instituted in Jamaica. We led that group, and as a result, in 1972, postgraduate training in major specialties started in Jamaica. Now, when I went off to Britain with my wife, she did dermatology, I did clinical pharmacology. When we came home to Barbados eventually in 1977, we didn't have postgraduate training here except in ophthalmology. Professor Waldron had started that. But he and I then worked together to develop postgraduate training programs so that we don't have doctors leaving Barbados and having to go to the USA to get that specialty training, because we lose most of them. Very few of them who go abroad come back like me and my wife to develop Barbados. So this has been a major change that took place in the second half of the 20th century, from the 1970s on, developing the postgraduate training here. That means that we have kept a lot more of our doctors than we would have in the past. So people do go into specialties now much more readily because they can get the specialty training here. And a lot of our young doctors are perhaps not as adventurous as they were in the past. A lot of our young doctors don't want to go anywhere outside of Barbados because if they live at home, mommy does the laundry and the cooking. And so they don't have to fend for themselves, you see. Many of us suffered vigorously, almost to starvation point at times when our money ran out, cooking for ourselves or finding food for ourselves when we were training. I would say that young doctors today often go into medicine because they are dedicated, but without sometimes realizing the obstacles that they have to achieve. Because in the English system which we adopted, it's 5 years of medical training, 1 year of internship is 6. And unless you wish to be a family doctor, to be a specialist, it's another 4 years and then experience. So you're in for the long haul. Basically 6 years minimum. We have a family medicine program now for at least 1 year, which is not mandatory yet, but I hope the Medical Council will make it mandatory. So we're talking 6 or 7 years to be a family doctor and 11 to 12 years to become a specialist. And most young women don't want to do that. Many young men don't want to do that. Many people would prefer to become salesmen and buy a BMW within 3 years, you know. So it is a challenge identifying the right people for the job of medicine. It requires enormous dedication. And I would like to think that in Barbados, where we have the smallest of the medical classes of the 3 campuses, that my generation has been able to inspire younger doctors to be committed and dedicated and conscientious.
You mentioned public health earlier.
Yes.
Is Barbados succeeding in the area of public health?
Oh, I think magnificently. When I became Dean of Medicine in 2001, we had a very unsatisfactory member of the faculty, one single person teaching public health. He was not Barbadian and he did not have a handle on the situation. And I realized as dean that we needed to develop public health in a very major way. We didn't have enough public health doctors in Barbados. We simply didn't have the formal training in public health that excited people to go into the field. And so we now have a very strong public health unit in the Faculty of Medicine and the Chronic Disease Research Center. We have 4 practitioners, 4 faculty members in these 2 parts of the Medical Faculty and Research Division working in public health. We are training people better in public health, and we have good public health doctors who have come out of this more modern approach. People like Dr. Anton Best, whom I have trained, people in Jamaica who have done the doctorate in public health. We do the diploma in public health here. So public health training has now been really raised to a much better level, and I think Barbados is now handling public health very well, as the COVID pandemic showed.
Sir Henry, you are the founding director of the George Allen Chronic Disease Research Center. You're also founding director of the Clinical Pharmacology Lab and Hypertension Clinic at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital.
Yes.
Now, over the years, you would have been quoted in the media on countless occasions, pleading with Barbadians to take better care of their health.
Yes.
We are seeing more strokes, more heart attacks, more people being diagnosed with hypertension, diabetes, etc. Where are we now in terms of fighting lifestyle diseases?
That's a very hard question to answer with any accuracy. When I came home, one of the things that struck me was the number of very overweight people in Barbados.
And just to be clear, when you came home, what year are we talking
This is
about?
1977.
So a long time ago.
When I walked into the medical clinic on my very first day, and I surveyed the area where there were 20 or 30 people sitting, I thought to myself, well, why are all these delightfully plump ladies here, you know? Is it that they've just come for the socialization? And I rapidly realized that most of them, almost all of them, had either diabetes or hypertension or both. And some had had their strokes already, and some had their kidney problems and so on. And so Dr. Hoyas and I did one of my first research studies here, looking at obesity and the problems of obesity. And what we found was that obesity went rapidly up from normal body weights at 20 right up to people in their seventh decade, the 60 to 69-year-olds. These people were by far the heaviest people. And we looked at their morbidity and so on, and they had significant morbidity. And the difference between the men and the women in the medical clinic was dramatic. And then we had the work that Dr. Ramsey, Sir Frank Ramsey, did at the Nutrition Center. Now, he is the brilliant national public health hero who cured malnutrition in Barbados. And he did that through outreach with his nurses, educating mothers, so that the malnutrition rates in infants in Barbados in 1955, say, were among the highest in the Caribbean. By 1977, when I came down, it had virtually disappeared. And I credit him, therefore, with recognizing that while we'd solved the malnutrition in infants, we were producing overnutrition in adults. And so he did the first survey of health status, including body weights and anthropometry, high blood pressure, and so on. That survey was done in 1979, and I assisted him with that. And out of that came my recognition that we simply were not doing enough in Barbados or the Caribbean about the chronic diseases. We were seeing increasing numbers. Jamaica, for example, was way behind us. We did a study called ICSHIB, the International Study of Hypertension in Blacks, ICSHIB, and we saw that Barbadians were by far the largest community, men down here, women up here. And when we went to St. Lucia, it was a bit better. When we went to Jamaica, it was much better because the Jamaican economy was so much worse than ours. So a survey in Jamaica demonstrated far slimmer people than in Barbados. And so eventually I realized we're talking now a lot about this, but we're not doing anything. So I decided that I would therefore develop a research center specifically to study chronic diseases and its complications. And at that time, the term was not very common, but I decided that to name it the Chronic Disease Research Center produced a lovely rolling name, CDRC. It's a lovely thing that rolls off the tongue, the CDRC. And so we've developed that. We've got a lot of international funding for it. And more important, in my view, we got partnerships with the Ministry of Health. We were able, through a brilliant PS in Health, Mr. Lionel Weeks, to work with the Ministry of Health, and they provided funding for one of the most important studies we've done, which is the stroke study, with Professor Hennis, who came back as a young graduate with his PhD in public health. We developed all these programs with international funding, but we got the Ministry of Health to co-fund and to partner with us. So that led to the development of the stroke unit at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, because we were seeing more than one stroke every day in Barbados, an average of 1.5 strokes. Now you ask how far we got in educating people. Have we made a difference? It's hard to answer. We're doing ongoing studies. They are doing ongoing studies at the George Allen Chronic Disease Research Center, looking at the progress and what is happening. My concern is that as a nation, people in Barbados have all the information, but it does not seem to resonate. And we find that hard to understand. In the old days when smoking was a problem, and Dr. Tony Gale virtually cured that in the nation, not a lot of Barbadians smoke, but men who smoked would not give up smoking until they had their heart attack. The doctor would advise them. Their wife would tell them, I don't like your breath, but they would keep on smoking. And they didn't stop until they had the heart attack. And some even went back smoking after the heart attack. So eating is almost like smoking. It can be addictive for many people.
It is.
And for many people, therefore, it's impossible to resist. It might be the wonderful sweet chocolate. It might be the cakes. It might be the rice and peas with the gravy on top. But people have their addictions to food. And for many people who are not in happy domestic relations, then eating is a kind of salve. And so it's hard for people to grasp the reality. People say it won't happen to me. But it does. I have been wanting to have the Chronic Disease Research Centre work with our social scientists and our psychologists to explore this. A friend of mine, Dr. Eugene Tull, who is a son of Barbadians and who is a professor of public health, first at the University of Pennsylvania and then working with St. Croix, where he was born. Dr. Tull came to Barbados and he established very clearly with 2 studies that he did with some of his students whom he brought down working with us based at the CDRC. These are papers with Tull, Taylor and Fraser. And he demonstrated the connection between unhappy young ladies and their eating habits and their obesity. In other words, he did a population study and he looked at the behavioral patterns and he looked at the emotions and the concerns of these folk. And he found that there were a number of emotional triggers that made young women eat. It's not possible to go into those details now, but it shows that there is a potential for exploring this properly. But we haven't yet found a way in to the behavioral studies that we hope might help to change behavior to make patients healthy. What we've done, I think, is to stem the tide. In other words, the increasing obesity, the increasing stroke rates, the increasing diabetes over the years. We think we are holding it stable, but we yet haven't found the way of reversing it.
Over the years, has there been a single NCD, one NCD that worries you more than the others?
I think, yes, high blood pressure, because this is known as the silent killer. So high blood pressure is related to damage to the arteries. The 2 go hand in hand. So people with hypertension often don't know they have it until they have their first stroke. And it is a fact that Barbadian men don't like going to doctors for a variety of reasons. So men with high blood pressure often don't have it picked up until later. But high blood pressure does go hand in hand with diabetes. Now, there's much more high blood pressure than there is diabetes. If you look at a population, if you look at any age band, say the 60-year-olds, you would find that there's twice as much hypertension, or 2.5 times as much hypertension as there is the diabetes. So the diabetes is devastating. It's not quite as common as the hypertension, but they tend to occur together. And we have in medicine a phrase called the deadly quartet. Now, there are some people who say, you mustn't use that phrase, it frightens people. But often people have to be scared before they take protective action.
That is a fact.
You see? Yeah. That's what happens. And the deadly quartet refers to the abnormal blood fats, the lipids, what we call cholesterol. Now, there's a good cholesterol and a bad cholesterol, because cholesterol has a function in the body. So there's an abnormal blood lipid or blood fat. There is the overweight itself. And then there's the high blood pressure and the diabetes. So these 4 things we call the deadly quartet. And if you've got all 4, then you really need to pay close attention. And if you lower your body weight, then you lower your blood pressure, you lower your body fat, and you can avoid your diabetes. Work at the Chronic Disease Research Centre has shown that a very rigorous diet, a very low-calorie, high-protein diet associated with moderate exercise can actually reverse diabetes. But it means that you cannot continue to eat that 3,000-calorie plate that when you go to a buffet, the plate looks like a mountain. You cannot continue eating like that. You've got to cut it right down to the basic requirement of a small amount of fat, adequate protein, and a few calories. And it means cutting the average intake of the average Barbadian down to 1/3 of what they were eating. And that will reverse the diabetes, lower the blood pressure, lower the body weight. But it requires discipline. It requires motivation. It requires so much insight. We haven't found the solution to the behavioral problem. I hope we will.
All right, so Henry, we haven't touched the surface as yet. Still a lot more to discuss. Stay with us. You're watching One on One.
The Barbados Police Service is a dynamic organization which caters to the needs of all residents by providing excellent customer service within our communities. We are excited to inform you that we are recruiting new members to our ranks and welcome your participation.
We are building the Barbados Police Service within our communities. Are you smart, skillful, motivated, ambitious, reliable, and talented?
Smart to fulfill your life's dream.
Smart to chart career opportunities.
Smart to make a difference.
Smart to pursue economic sustainability.
Smart to enable change.
Smart to provide public service.
I say to you today, if you have a love for people, if you enjoy nurturing your communities and taking care of persons, then definitely the Barbados Police Service, of which I am a proud member, is the place for you. So I encourage you, lend us a hand, join us now to help keep Barbados safe.
Come join us, join me in making our country a safer Barbados.
Your place is here in the Barbados Police Service.
Come, join our ranks and chart a career of economic sustainability. Make that difference as an agent of change while providing public service as you fulfill your life's dream.
When does a mental health issue become a problem? When should you reach out for help? I'm Krisnan Hurdle, clinical psychologist and certified life coach. Mental health issues interrupt a person's daily functions. An issue becomes a disorder when a person isn't able to carry out their everyday activities like household duties, personal upkeep and hygiene, or interferes with their ability to function socially, to interact with others inside the household, or interferes with their ability to function on the job or carry out other activities. If a person finds themselves needing to self-isolate, losing touch with reality, or having an impaired ability to think, reason, or function, and if this occurs over a period of days, weeks, or months, then it is time that they reach out for help.
Welcome back. We're chatting with Professor Emeritus Sir Henry Fraser. Sir Henry, before the break, we were discussing non-communicable diseases. We are dealing with an aging population in Barbados, and in many older people, we're seeing several comorbidities. Are we aging as a healthy society?
And my answer really is no, because we have got a particular spectrum of people who in the post-independence era have been getting fatter and fatter and fatter. And now these people who are aging have all of this diabetes and hypertension. Hypertension increases almost with age, so that in the 40th decade, the 50th decade, 40 to 50, the prevalence of hypertension in our population is almost 40%. When you get to 70, the prevalence of the population of hypertension is like 60%. It increases dramatically. What we found in our centenarian study carried out by the brilliant Dr. Susan Archer 20 years ago was that the centenarians were people who had never had high blood pressure, never been treated for that, never had diabetes, and invariably had never been obese. These were the healthy heroes. I call these people the healthy heroes. They didn't have any chronic diseases, they were not obese, and fourthly, they were almost all physically active. They were the healthy heroes who survived to 100. And we interviewed all of the ones who survived to 100. All this was assessed by Susan Archer, and we tested them. They didn't have diabetes, they didn't have high blood pressure, they'd always been slim, and they reached 100. Now, they also had other factors. Religion was a very strong component, and social activity was a very strong component. Most of them were women. 80% were women, only 20% were men. And most of the women had had several children. Those who did not have children themselves were godmothers to a whole range of children. They were like the family guru or the village guru who everybody came to, and they were mentally very, very active. So we can say that living healthy requires that you keep slim, keep physically active, avoid hypertension and diabetes by eating much less, and have your brain stimulated by your social activities. That is terribly important. And I don't think we have got these messages across satisfactorily to people. And sometimes people say if you say things too often, people switch off. So they're not actually listening to the message. But the thing that I would like to see about the care for the elderly is daycare centers for the elderly. I have preached this for 40 years. I did my first study of the elderly in 1982, just 40 years and a bit ago. And I've given copies of that report to every successive minister and health for 30 years. And then I gave up because they take no notice of these things. But we have, for example, a model daycare center for the elderly, which caters to 30 people at St. Barnabas Home. And that daycare center, at the St. Barnabas Daycare Center by the church, allows people to be physically active, to have social intercourse during the day, to take part in activities that they would not take part in if they were at home alone. And it is such a brilliant no-brainer, but I've never been able to get the government or other churches to take that to heart. That is one of the big solutions for the care of our elderly.
I want to switch now from medicine. You are an architectural historian. You focus on historic preservation. So it's no surprise that we're here recording at the headquarters of the Barbados National Trust here at Wilde Great House. Yeah. Are we doing enough in Barbados to protect our historic buildings?
Categorically, no, 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 and no. I realized when I went to North America on a conference and a lecture tour across Western USA, San Diego, San Francisco, right across Canada, giving lectures, to every town that I went, my host took me to see historic sites. Everything that I read at that time was part of a wave of historic preservation. And I got into that act because I was persuaded that heritage tourism was a big thing. And in North America, where the buildings were not usually more than 100 or 200 years old, we were in Barbados where we had buildings 300 and 400 years old. And what really moved me was the proposal to demolish the synagogue and build over the synagogue and the cemetery a new Hall of Justice or Supreme Court. And that really got me started because I thought this was sacrilegious and amazing. And the Jewish community, led by Paul Altman, did a great deal to preserve that. But this is an indication of the rather Philistine approach that Barbadians have to our heritage. Heritage tourism is the fastest growing aspect of tourism in the world today. There's no question about it. The era of sun, sand, and sea, and a little sex on the side, and the bikinis and all of that, is a minor component of tourism now. The 60, 70-year-old retiree doesn't come to Barbados to lie on the beach in the sun and get skin cancer and more wrinkles. That is definitely not what people want to do. And there's a lot of heritage around the world that people are going for. So why are we ignoring it? Because we're ambivalent about it. In Antigua, they're not quite as ambivalent. And Nelson's Dockyard promotes the hero Nelson, who was the English hero, not the Barbadian hero, but the English hero. And they're very proud of the fact that Nelson was based there. And the Nelson Dockyard has made Antigua famous. And there's no visitor who goes to Antigua without going to Nelson's Dockyard. We had our historic garrison inscribed in 2011, 12 years ago, and we have basically done nothing about it. It's not recognized as being important. And the number of derelict buildings in the garrison now are beginning to match the number of useful buildings because we have simply not recognized the importance. I think this is ambivalence. I think we are all upset, distressed, worried, embarrassed, and some people would rather forget the existence of slavery. But it means that buildings that were built in the slave days, like those ancient garrison buildings that were built before the end of slavery, but largely by the British soldiers, those buildings are, if you like, a relic of the worst aspects of colonialism. We were the theater of war in the Caribbean, and the garrison in Barbados was how the British maintained their supremacy. But those buildings we are ambivalent about. And similarly, magnificent architecture across the island, whether it's churches, the beautiful Gothic churches, which were used, as some people call, to provide the opium for the people. Those beautiful buildings often are neglected. One or two of them demolished. Rectories have been demolished or allowed to decay, like Bishop's Court. These are buildings that can be restored and maintained for tourism. And it is the most priceless aspect. It's like built gold that the visitors want to see, but they don't know about, because our tourism marketing continues to market the beach, the sea, and the wonderful food. The rum punch I'm very happy to market, because rum is our most important product. But we don't see the holistic approach to the fact that we need the plantations to grow the sugarcane, to produce the molasses, or as St. Nicholas Abbey does, produce the syrup, to make the rum that makes our name. So we need to make more rum to make our name, because it's a very good way of doing that. Sugar doesn't do it anymore alone, but we do need to plant more sugar. So the whole history that we have that we're ambivalent about is simply important for our economy and our livelihoods. I've just been through St. John, and I have to say that I wept to see that St. John has become the real New Forest of Barbados. It's not yet turned as all wood, but all those plantations, 7 of them that Clico bought, I think it's about 2,000 acres. I may be wrong about the amount, but it's about 2,000 acres of St. John spread across St. John, from Henley in the east to Wakefield in the west, all bush. Some of the driveways into the old plantation yard, which employed people, those driveways are blocked by bush. We have a new forest across St. John, and we are not growing any sugar to fuel the factories. It is an amazing situation. And when you see the cowitch and the bush, you can only weep in St. John, because the employment of St. John has gone to pot. And that adds to the movement of the traffic, which produces the traffic jams into Bridgetown, because people who would have worked supervising work on a plantation are perhaps now working in Bridgetown, hence the bottlenecks. But this is our problem. Heritage tourism is a huge potential for us, but we are blind to it.
And I hear you and I understand you when you speak about heritage tourism, but does the average Barbadian themselves know about the significance of these historic buildings?
Not the average Barbadian. People who may do craft and work in the cruise ship, the tour buses and so on, are familiar with it. I mean, when I go to St. John's Parish Church on any day of the week, I see hundreds of visitors at St. John's Parish Church, but we are not doing anything to actually promote that per se in our marketing. The cruise ships know how important St. John's Parish Church is, so they will charge the tourist a fee. The tourist goes to St. John's Parish Church, enjoys the magnificent architecture, the fascination of the cemetery, the great view from St. John's, from Pico Tenerife back to Ragged Point. They don't pay a cent for that. They pay the tour buses. So this is an area of tourism that I think hasn't been adequately developed. The gardens around Barbados, they're wonderful gardens, from Andromeda Gardens in St. Joseph down to Patria Gardens in St. James. That's a beautiful garden people don't know about. The owner of Patria Gardens, I don't think markets it very well. Andromeda now markets it very well because we have a dynamic Sharon Cook marketing Andromeda. And so that is coming back from its bad days. The National Trust itself is now coming back from a very bad period, partly to do with COVID epidemic. But we do not understand the importance of it. Only people who have gotten into the trade that involves a heritage site or a garden, a botanical garden. You know, Barbadians are now excited about the 200-acre botanical garden at Corridon College. But, you know, they didn't use Queen's Park, which I call the lungs of Bridgetown, adequately. Some of them have never been to Andromeda Gardens or the Orchid World or Hunt's Gardens. These are places of enormous beauty, but they're not well marketed.
That's the biggest issue, the marketing.
That's the problem. The marketing is important, and individual entities do not market very well. Anthony Hunt is very good at marketing. And I think he's best known internationally of all the heritage sites in Barbados because he markets well. But our tourist administrators are not yet into that package. If you go on the website, you'll see a picture of Nicholas Abbey and one or two other pictures, but it's not the main theme. And that's our problem.
Sir Henry, you were a public orator at the Cave Hill campus from 1992 until 2010 and the National Public Orator for Barbados from 1998 until 2013. There has always been this debate about children, especially speaking proper English versus dialect.
Right.
Your views?
Well, my view, first of all, I don't use the term proper English because it is a pejorative phrase. I use the term standard English. And I think it's important for us to recognize the bilingual nature of Barbadians. And I don't see why. I've said this to many people. I've said this to the Ministry of Education, to chief education officers over the years. One of our best exponents of Bajan dialect is our Prime Minister. But she's also a magnificent orator. She speaks eloquent standard English. She's a wordsmith. She always finds the right word. And she speaks standard English when she is speaking most of the time on television, internationally, and so on. But when she wants to go on the platform and talk dialect, she'll talk dialect as good as anybody else, okay? She knows the dialect. Now, why cannot we teach the difference between dialect and standard English from the time kids go to primary school? If you go to primary school and you know the syntax that we have inherited and passed on from our African forebears, if you understand that syntax, you can use that syntax when you want to. And if you know what standard English is, as I was taught by Earl Glasgow in Prep A at Lodge School, he taught me English in Prep A and he taught me English in 1A at the Lodge School. Now, Earl Glasgow was a brilliant Messiah Street graduate who taught standard English. And every now and again, he would show us that you could change into dialect. So if we taught that in our schools, nobody need be embarrassed about saying the wrong as opposed to standard English because they're speaking perfect dialect. We should not have people going to United Nations or a conference internationally or even on television in a serious debate speaking in between dialect and standard English. Standard English is better understood by most people who speak English than dialect. I've lived in Jamaica on 4 separate occasions for a total of 7.5 years. I've been to Jamaica, because I count, 163 times. I know Jamaican extremely well. But when your television colleagues put on CBC News at night interviews with the Jamaican, as they say, in the street, I could hardly understand a word that a market vendor in Coronation Market in Kingston has to say, in spite of my familiarity with Jamaican dialect. It is very hard to understand dialect, and you create confusion sometimes in the minds of other people. And that's why I think there's a role for dialect, and we should teach the difference between dialect and standard English from primary school.
So Henry, as an author, you have written more than a dozen books.
Yes.
Your newest book is this gem called A Life of Medicine and the Arts. Tell us about the inspiration behind this latest published work.
Okay, there were 2 sources of inspiration. One, about 15 years ago, when we were in Britain for the Christmas period, my daughter-in-law decided she was putting together a family book. And she asked Maureen, my wife, and me, if we would write her something about our family. So I wrote a 10-page review, a bit about my ancestors, my family, my childhood especially, and so on for this book. And she produced a glamorous book with this 10-page brief bio. And then Sir George Alleyne, who was my mentor, who taught me how to cannulate a rat, how to do research. He was my research mentor. I spent a medical elective and a year doing a fellowship with him, and my first 3 medical papers were Alleyne and Fraser and Alleyne. And that was great fun. And it's his name that's attached to the research center, because when Sir Hilary, the Vice Chancellor, wanted part of the university to name after Sir George Alleyne, he looked at something, he saw the relationship, Sir George training me, and then Sir George came when I opened the Chronic Disease Research Centre. I had Sir George unveiling the plaque at the opening. So his name is there as well. And he gave a talk at the opening. So it's the George Alleyne Chronic Disease Research Centre. But the second inspiration came from him, because he wrote his autobiography. And I had functioned with him a lot. I organized a symposium on his behalf when he retired, and I wrote about him and I talked about him. When he did his autobiography, I interviewed him for UETV, and I reviewed it for the papers and so on. And I thought to myself, well, Sir George has had a great life, and we've had a very similar life, because both of us took the decision that our Barbados scholarship would not be spent in Britain at Cambridge, as everyone said it should be. He and I both resisted our parents and our headmasters, and we went to the University of the West Indies in its young days in Jamaica in confidence that we wanted to be West Indians. So his autobiography inspired me, and I thought, well, there's a lot of similarity between what he has done, his local work, his research, his teaching, his PAHO job, my local work, my Caribbean regional work, my international work. All of this is quite similar to him. And I've had a very exciting time visiting all 6 continents and training all sorts of brilliant people. You know, it's been great fun. So that was my second inspiration for doing the book. And so the book is now 39 chapters on my life, from my childhood in St. John and the family of St. John, all the way down to my role as a senator. I had to be very careful about the senatorial role, because I'm not a politician. I never was. But you have to be very careful in terms of discussing political debates. Because what has tended to happen for me and a number of other significant, hardworking Barbadians is that when you make too many suggestions about development, you begin to seem to be a critic. And with each new administration, you talk initially with great success to a new Prime Minister, a new Minister of Health, and so on, and you seem to be on the same wavelength. But things change as the years go by, and by year 3 or 4, when you recognize that something that was a no-brainer hasn't been done, and you harp on it, then people say, well, you must belong to the other party. So in the beginning of each government, I'm making positive suggestions, but by the end of that administration, one seems to be not with the government because they're not doing the right things. Maybe they think they don't get enough votes or so on. But there are so many things that we could have in Barbados that would be advantageous to us. Recognition of the value of the World Heritage Site is the first thing that sticks out. But the recognition that we could have the modern equivalent of Dr. Bailey's diagnostic clinic. I have preached for years we could be the Mayo Clinic of the Caribbean. We had, when Jamaica and Trinidad had no decent water supply, no decent telephones, no decent electricity, we had it all. We should have developed a state-of-the-art hospital for the purpose of medical tourism for the entire region and North America. 1 million people leave North America every year to travel to the Far East for medical surgery. They could be coming down to Barbados 4 hours instead of 24 hours. We could have a magnificent state-of-the-art hospital, but every time it's talked about, it gets shelved. And that's a great pity. And I still say it's a great pity, and I still say we should be doing it. One of the teams that wanted to come in here is now in the Cayman Islands with what they call the Health City. And the Jamaicans now go to Cayman because they can't get the surgery they need in Jamaica. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We haven't got it. Cayman has it.
But what's holding us back in that regard?
I am never entirely sure what's holding back. The Bible says where there's no vision, the people perish. And a lot of people simply don't share that vision. They don't realize the potential. Sometimes we think the only thing we should be building is hotels, but we could build hotels which accommodate the visitors who come for surgery. Because one of the proposals for St. Joseph's Hospital, which went through the Edos, as they say, that proposal was contemplating and actually discussing with hoteliers the hotels that would cater to people who had surgery and would then go to a hotel for their recovery in the following week. So it would boost tourism tremendously if the St. Joseph Hospital scheme had come to pass. But it just never did. And I had one of my last jobs on retiring as dean, in the last couple of weeks of my job in 2010, before I left the university, was to interview the people tendering for the St. Joseph's Hospital site development. But it simply never came to pass. So there's a lot of things that could be done in Barbados, but at the moment our vision is hotel development. I don't think that's the only way to go unless you have a compensatory health tourism and heritage tourism. And it's the 2 H's, health, hospital, and heritage. 3 H's that would be important for our best development. If we had a state-of-the-art hospital, many of our doctors would be working in it. Many of our technicians, many of our nurses, the employment opportunities would be as great as the biggest hotel. And we would have a name for it, you know. Currently, we are thriving on the name of our magnificent Rihanna celebrity. But we could be thriving on health tourism, which is where it started with George Washington in 1751. Health tourism is a huge opportunity for us, just as big as heritage tourism. And I've written and I've talked about this in the Senate, in my columns, on my radio programs. But what can I say? Health tourism is not being pioneered in the way that it was even 100 years ago. Barbados was made famous in the 1920s, in the early cruise ship era, because it was called the Sanatorium of the Caribbean. And hotels like the Crane and the Hastings hotels thrived on this reputation. We've forgotten that. We're not using that, and we could.
So Henry, an hour is simply not enough time, but I appreciate you spending your time with us. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us this evening.
Thank you very much.
You are most welcome.
It's been fun.
It has been, as
and
promised.
Maybe we can do it again.
I hope so. I hope so. I'll hold you to that. That was Professor Emeritus Sir Henry Fraser. I am Lisa Lord. Thank you so much for watching One-on-One. Do have yourself a wonderful evening.